Gentleman from Albemarle, Mr. Bell.
Speaker, I'd like to address some of the issues that have been raised on this floor. So we're talking about the right to vote. Several people have called it that, spoken about it eloquently, but the issue is not whether you get to vote, it's whether your votes are counted. And the issue would be if people who are voting are not eligible, they are offsetting those precious votes that people have spoken of so eloquently before. And we do have IDs, as the gentleman from Manassas talked about. We ID for lots of things, and there's some things we don't. But here's the difference. We ID for things that are important. What is more important than making sure that we have the opportunity for eligible people to vote and to have their votes counted and not offset by people who aren't? Now, let me address a couple specific issues. Their question was raised about whether this is a real problem. Times Dispatch did an article that said there were 194 cases of voter fraud that the state police found to be founded in the last election. They're not finished with 2012 yet. I asked them to break it down based on what kind of violations those were. They said they couldn't, so I asked my local local electoral board, and here's what she said. I said, do you have an example? She said, yes. She said in the last election that a young man who had voted earlier in the day with his voter card, the same man showed up a little later in the day, was challenged by one of the election officials as somebody had already voted, and then off he ran. Just one example from Albemarle County. So it is a real problem. Mr. Speaker, the second thing was this issue of cost. This bill is closely modeled on the Georgia model. There are different approaches to do this. There's the Indiana model. There's the Georgia model. Georgia is the model where you can go get them at your local registrar's office, like this bill. Georgia has had this in place since about 2006. In the last 5 years, they have had 26,506 people take advantage of the free voter card, have come in and gotten it at the local registrar. That's where the cost comes from. This is not some ethereal number that they've come up with. This is actually based on actual numbers they think, based on the Georgia numbers. There are startup costs so that the equipment will be at each registrar's office, but after that, the cost is very cheap. As an aside, it does not require the documentation that the gentlelady from Richmond talked about. You are not applying for a driver's license. This is a voter ID card. It does not have those additional costs she raises. Number three, Mr. Speaker, is this issue about what actually you would do, how this would work. You go get the card if you need it, but if you don't, you cast a provisional ballot and you can still get the card afterwards and still have your vote counted. We have about as many safeguards in place as you possibly can to let somebody who did not have ID at the time get an ID in time to vote. And lastly, there's the issue about suppression. Mr. Speaker, the best evidence comes from Georgia. And in Georgia, they have had this in place since 2006, and they have the same setup for how you would get the ID card. In terms of minority increases, from 2006 to 2010, the minority increased in the black community by 44% in terms of votes. The Latino community increased by 67%. If you care, the white increase during that time was just 12%. Mr. Speaker, these numbers come from the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, and they point out that, yes, the 2008 election was an unusual election for lots of reasons, and so perhaps you'd say that's an outlier, but those numbers continue to track through to 20 and 10. There is no voter suppression from this issue. What we're trying to do is make sure, I'll yield as soon as I'm done. We're trying to make sure that the person who comes and presents himself at the polls as a certain person is in fact that person before we give him that precious right to vote that has been spoken of so eloquently and let him exercise it on behalf of someone. Mr. Speaker, I'm happy to yield.